In a week already thick with tension, whispered betrayals, and emotional reckonings, Remy's long-anticipated confrontation with Dylan finally unfolds, setting into motion a cascade of revelations that ripple across every corner of their intertwined lives, while Hope, weary of uncertainty and emotional stalemates, reaches her breaking point and delivers an ultimatum that forces Ridge and Steffy to confront truths they've long avoided. The drama begins quietly, almost deceptively so, as Remy arrives at Dylan's studio under the guise of closure, yet beneath the calm exterior lies months of suppressed questions, unresolved loyalty, and a desire not simply for answers, but for clarity about where he stands in Dylan's complicated world. And as the door closes behind them, the air grows heavy with expectation, Remy wasting no time before revealing that what he truly wants is honesty. Raw, unfiltered honesty about Dylan's intentions, his feelings, and whether their connection was ever real or merely convenient during a turbulent chapter of Dylan's life. And Dylan, visibly shaken by the directness, struggles at first to respond, offering half-formed explanations that only deepen Remy's frustration until the conversation sharpens into something more vulnerable, more dangerous, as Remy admits that his investment was never casual, that he saw a future where Dylan seemed uncertain, and that living in emotional ambiguity has become unbearable, prompting Dylan to finally confess that fear, not indifference, kept him distant. Fear of repeating past mistakes, fear of hurting someone he genuinely cares about, and perhaps most revealing of all, fear of choosing one path and losing another forever, a confession that leaves both men suspended between relief and heartbreak because acknowledgement does not automatically translate into resolution. Meanwhile, across town, Hope wrestles with a different but equally consuming dilemma as she observes the increasingly unified front presented by Ridge and Steffy, a partnership that once reassured her but now feels exclusionary, almost strategic, as decisions affecting family, business, and personal relationships unfold without her voice being fully heard. And after weeks of patience, she decides that silence is no longer an option, arranging a meeting that neither Ridge nor Steffy anticipates will become a defining moment. Yet from the moment Hope begins speaking, it becomes clear she has reached emotional exhaustion, calmly but firmly outlining how their actions have placed her in a position where loyalty feels one-sided, where compromise has been expected only from her, and where the constant balancing act between peacekeeping and self-respect has grown impossible to sustain. And Ridge, initially defensive, attempts to frame recent choices as necessary leadership decisions, while Steffy argues that stability sometimes requires difficult boundaries. But Hope refuses to retreat, delivering an ultimatum that reframes the entire conversation. Either they begin treating her as an equal participant whose concerns carry genuine weight, or she will step away from collaborations, from alliances, and potentially from relationships that no longer nurture mutual respect. The declaration landing with unexpected force because Hope has historically been the mediator, the one willing to absorb tension for the sake of harmony. And seeing her draw a definitive line unsettles both Ridge and Steffy in ways they struggle to conceal. Back at Dylan's studio, the emotional fallout continues as Remy presses further, asking whether Dylan truly wants a future together or merely the comfort of knowing Remy will remain nearby regardless of commitment. And Dylan's hesitation speaks volumes before words even form, revealing an internal battle between desire and caution, between longing and self-preservation, until he finally admits that he wants more but does not yet trust himself to sustain it, a statement that both validates Remy's feelings and devastates him simultaneously, because hope without certainty feels like another form of waiting, and Remy, recognizing the familiar pattern, explains that love cannot thrive in perpetual hesitation, that vulnerability requires action rather than intention, and that he cannot continue investing emotional energy into a possibility that remains perpetually postponed. The conversation evolving into a quiet reckoning, where both men acknowledge the depth of their connection yet confront the reality that timing and readiness may not align, leaving them to decide whether patience represents devotion or self-betrayal. As this emotional crossroads unfolds, Hope's ultimatum reverberates through Ridge and Steffy's dynamic, forcing them into a rare moment of introspection as they replay recent events and begin to recognize patterns they previously justified as leadership or protection but which now appear dismissive through Hope's perspective, and Ridge, grappling with guilt, acknowledges that in trying to maintain control he may have inadvertently silenced voices that mattered most, while Steffy wrestles with the realization that her drive to safeguard family interests sometimes manifests as rigidity, creating distance rather than unity, their discussion revealing cracks not only in their professional partnership but in their understanding of loyalty itself. And for the first time both consider that Hope's ultimatum is not an act of rebellion, but a plea for balance, an insistence that relationships must evolve beyond hierarchy if they are to survive. Elsewhere, the emotional stakes continue rising as Remy leaves Dylan's studio uncertain whether their conversation marked a beginning or an ending, replaying every word in his mind while grappling with the painful awareness that clarity often comes at the cost of comfort, and Dylan, left alone, confronts the silence that follows honesty, realizing that indecision may ultimately cost him someone who challenged him to grow beyond fear, prompting a moment of self-reflection rarely seen from him as he begins questioning whether protecting himself has become synonymous with avoiding happiness altogether. Simultaneously, Hope waits anxiously for Ridge and Steffy's response, aware that ultimatums carry risk, that asserting boundaries can lead either to renewed respect or irreversible distance. Yet she feels a newfound sense of empowerment rooted in self-worth rather than approval. And when Ridge finally reaches out requesting another conversation, why? As the emotional aftershocks of those pivotal confrontations continue to ripple through every relationship, the atmosphere surrounding Remy, Dylan, Hope, Ridge, and Steffy shifts from explosive confrontation to uneasy transition, a phase far more dangerous because it requires sustained change rather than dramatic declarations. And in the days following their heartfelt exchange, Remy finds himself cautiously optimistic yet guarded, aware that Dylan's promise of intentional effort represents only the first step in rebuilding trust that had eroded through hesitation and emotional distance. And though Dylan makes genuine attempts to prove his sincerity, calling when he says he will, showing up without being asked, and opening conversations he once avoided, Remy struggles with the lingering fear that vulnerability might once again leave him exposed, creating moments where warmth and doubt coexist. Their interactions filled with subtle tests neither openly acknowledges, while Dylan, determined not to retreat into old patterns, confronts the discomfort of accountability, recognizing that love demands consistency rather than grand gestures alone, and each honest conversation becomes both healing and exhausting as they learn to navigate a connection no longer defined by ambiguity, but by conscious choice. Meanwhile, Hope's ultimatum continues reshaping the dynamic at the heart of Ridge and Steffy's world, as meetings once dominated by firm decisions and unchallenged authority now carry an unfamiliar pause, a deliberate effort to invite Hope's perspective before conclusions are drawn, and although the adjustment feels awkward at first, it signals a meaningful shift in power and respect. Yet beneath the surface tension remains, particularly for Steffy, who wrestles privately with the fear that compromise might weaken her influence, prompting moments where old instincts resurface and she nearly reverts to controlling conversations, only to catch herself and reconsider. An internal battle revealing how deeply ingrained habits resist change even when intentions evolve, while Ridge, motivated by regret and a desire to restore unity, becomes the unexpected mediator, encouraging open dialogue rather than decisive rulings, discovering that leadership rooted in collaboration strengthens loyalty rather than undermines authority. At the same time, external pressures begin complicating matters further when rumors circulate suggesting upcoming business challenges that could test the fragile harmony they are attempting to rebuild, forcing Ridge and Steffy to confront whether their renewed respect for Hope can withstand real stress, and Hope herself senses the looming trial, understanding that ultimatums hold meaning only when followed by sustained confidence in one's own voice, leading her to step forward with ideas and strategies she might previously have withheld, surprising both Ridge and Steffy with her decisiveness and reminding them that inclusion does not dilute strength but multiplies it. Back in Dylan's world, however, growth proves uneven as old insecurities resurface, when unexpected reminders of past relationships trigger his fear of inadequacy, causing him to withdraw momentarily just as Remy begins allowing himself to feel secure again. And the resulting tension forces another difficult conversation where Remy refuses to chase reassurance, yet refuses equally to accept silence, calmly explaining that progress cannot exist without transparency, a statement that pushes Dylan toward a deeper realization that commitment requires confronting discomfort immediately rather than retreating from it. And for perhaps the first time, Dylan shares fears he had long hidden, admitting that he worries about failing someone who believes in him so fully, an admission that transforms the moment from conflict into intimacy, showing Remy a vulnerability that strengthens their bond even as it reveals the ongoing work ahead. Elsewhere, Hope begins noticing subtle changes in Steffy's demeanor, moments of unexpected openness where rivalry softens into cautious respect, particularly during a tense planning session where Steffy unexpectedly supports Hope's proposal rather than challenging it, an action that surprises everyone in the room and signals genuine evolution. Though afterwards Steffy privately confesses to Ridge that relinquishing control feels unsettling, prompting Ridge to remind her that growth often feels like loss before it reveals itself as freedom, a realization Steffy begins slowly to accept as she witnesses improved collaboration leading to stronger outcomes. As these emotional transformations unfold, secondary relationships around them react as well, friends and colleagues sensing shifts in tone, alliances realigning as communication becomes more transparent, and the environment once fueled by unspoken resentment begins gradually replacing suspicion with cautious optimism, yet no one mistakes progress for perfection, understanding that trust rebuilds through repeated actions rather than singular apologies. Remy and Dylan's journey reaches another turning point during a quiet evening away from the noise of expectations, where laughter replaces analysis and they rediscover the simplicity that first drew them together, allowing both to recognize that while love requires work, it should also bring ease, a balance they are only now learning to achieve. And Remy, observing Dylan's willingness to remain emotionally present even in uncomfortable moments, begins releasing the protective distance he once maintained, choosing faith not as blind optimism but as a conscious risk rooted in observed change. Simultaneously, Hope's strengthened position encourages her to reassess not only professional dynamics but personal fulfillment, realizing that asserting boundaries has rekindled confidence she had gradually lost, leading her to approach relationships with renewed clarity and refuse compromises that diminish her sense of self, a transformation that inspires Ridge to reevaluate his own past decisions and Steffy to reconsider how strength and empathy can coexist without contradiction. However, just as stability begins to take root, unforeseen complications emerge when conflicting priorities threaten to reignite old tensions, testing whether newfound understanding can survive under pressure. As the fragile calm settles into something resembling stability, the emotional landscape surrounding Remy, Dylan, Hope, Ridge, and Steffy continues evolving in ways none of them could have predicted when confrontation first forced honesty into the open, and what initially felt like isolated turning points gradually reveals itself as a collective transformation, each decision influencing another life, each moment of courage reshaping the emotional foundation upon which their relationships now stand. Remy, once guarded by necessity, begins allowing himself to envision a future not defined by uncertainty, yet even as hope grows, he remains mindful that trust rebuilt slowly can fracture quickly, prompting him to observe Dylan's actions with quiet attentiveness rather than anxious expectation, while Dylan, increasingly aware of how close he came to losing something meaningful, commits himself not only to emotional transparency but to personal growth beyond the relationship itself. Recognizing that becoming dependable requires confronting patterns long before they affect others, and this internal work leads him to reconnect with parts of himself he had neglected, creative ambitions, friendships placed on hold, and emotional honesty that once felt threatening but now feels liberating, creating a healthier balance that strengthens rather than strains his bond with Remy. Meanwhile, Hope's ultimatum continues producing ripple effects far beyond the immediate conversation with Ridge and Steffy, reshaping workplace dynamics and personal relationships alike, as colleagues who once hesitated to voice disagreement now feel encouraged to contribute openly, transforming the environment into one where collaboration thrives, and Hope herself discovers that asserting boundaries has not isolated her as she once feared, but instead earned deeper respect. A realization that empowers her to step more confidently into leadership, proposing initiatives that reflect both compassion and strategic insight, surprising even herself with the clarity of her vision, while Ridge observes her evolution with admiration mixed with humility, acknowledging privately that he underestimated her resilience and insight, and Steffy, though still adjusting to shared authority, begins recognizing the relief that comes from not carrying responsibility alone, finding unexpected strength in partnership rather than control. However, growth rarely unfolds without resistance and tensions resurface when external pressures intensify, forcing difficult decisions that test whether lessons learned can withstand real stakes, particularly when competing interests threaten unity and old instincts tempt Ridge and Steffy to revert to decisive, unilateral action. Yet this time Hope intervenes not with confrontation but with calm insistence on dialogue, reminding them that progress requires consistency, and her steady presence prevents escalation, proving that transformation lies not in eliminating conflict, but in changing how it is handled. At the same time, Remy and Dylan encounter a new emotional challenge when the honeymoon phase of renewed connection gives way to ordinary realities, miscommunications, scheduling conflicts, moments of exhaustion where patience wears thin, and for the first time they must navigate disagreement without the dramatic urgency that once forced resolution, learning instead the quieter skill of everyday compromise. And those small arguments arise, they discover that honesty shared early prevents resentment from taking root, reinforcing the trust they fought to rebuild, while Remy realizes that love no longer feels like waiting for certainty, but participating in its creation, and Dylan learns that vulnerability practiced consistently becomes less frightening over time. Elsewhere, Steffy undergoes perhaps the most subtle yet profound change, confronting internal questions about identity and purpose beyond competition and protection, and during a reflective conversation with Ridge, she admits that much of her strength has been shaped by fear of losing control, a fear rooted in past betrayals, prompting Ridge to share his own regrets about prioritizing authority over emotional awareness, their exchange marking a rare moment of mutual vulnerability that deepens their understanding of one another and strengthens their partnership in unexpected ways. As weeks turn into months, the interconnected stories begin weaving together more visibly, with social gatherings and shared projects revealing new dynamics where laughter replaces guarded politeness and disagreements unfold without emotional devastation, signaling healthier foundations taking hold. And Hope notices how Steffy now actively seeks her input rather than merely tolerating it, while Ridge encourages collaboration openly, creating an environment that feels less like a hierarchy and more like a family rediscovering balance. Simultaneously, Dylan faces an opportunity that challenges everything he has learned about commitment, a chance requiring travel and temporary distance. Yet instead of making decisions alone, he invites Remy into the conversation from the beginning, demonstrating the very growth Remy once feared impossible, and together they navigate fears about separation, ultimately choosing trust over avoidance, understanding that independence and partnership need not exist in opposition. Remy, reflecting on how far they have come, recognizes that love is no longer defined by grand declarations but by daily effort, the willingness to communicate, to listen, to remain present even when life grows complicated, and this realization allows him finally to release lingering resentment, embracing the relationship not as something fragile, but as something resilient precisely because it has survived uncertainty. Meanwhile, Hope experiences her own personal awakening as she realizes that the ultimatum she delivered was less about changing Ridge and Steffy than about reclaiming her own voice, and with that awareness comes renewed confidence influencing every aspect of her life.